Well, good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome once again to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. Well, tonight I'm going to wrap up my reading of War Against the Weak. I skipping a few chapters because I can't read the whole book, and I'll go through some of the topics in the last few chapters and then wrap it up with the last chapter, which is called Eugenics. What now? So let's go back. We just finished the chapter on Buchenwald, and honestly, the next chapter is on Auschwitz. And having just done a chapter on Buchenwald, I just can't face it. I don't want to read. And you can imagine the chapter. It's not any really new material. Hello, everyone. By the way, I hope the audio is improved from this morning. If anybody would give me a 5x5, I'd appreciate seeing that. I've got the screen up closer to my face so I can see the chat today, and great to see everybody here. Hi, Tyrone, Corky, Kathy, Corky again, and ECAT. Great to have you all here, and thanks again. I feel really great in the safe hands of our producer, Andy Dybala. Just checking the visuals there to see what's good. Moved things around a little bit more, and just going to keep experimenting as we settle into our new studio space here at Mystery Island Studio. Audio is better? Good. Excellent. So the chapter on Auschwitz, it's the camp of Joseph Mengele, the angel of death. And one of the things that you notice is his fascination with twins, and the twins that were saved from the immediate gas chambers where most people went. The twins were then, of course, taken for cruel medical experiments conducted by Mengele. The sadistic experiments were considered by many to be the inexplicable actions of a scientist gone utterly mad. That's what people would say after the war. But in fact, Mengele was following a fascinating research topic that was continuously discussed among eugenicists, going back to Galton. The topic was as important to the researchers at Cold Spring Harbor and the funders at the Rockefeller Foundation as it was to Nazi medical murderers in Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt. No word will ever capture the inhumanity of Auschwitz, but one word does explain why Auschwitz was the last fanatic stand of the eugenic crusade to create a super race, a superior race, and finally, a master race. As the cattle cars emptied their human cargo onto the ramp, as the helpless millions lined up for selection, they all heard one word shouted twice, and that word was twins. So I'm going to skip through the worst parts of it, but I guarantee you it's all here in the book. The next chapter is called From Ashes to Aftermath, and it discusses what happened when the Russian army approached Auschwitz. Mengele went from office to methodically gathering his research materials. He came into my office without a word, recounted pathologist Martina Putznia. He took all my papers, put them in boxes, and had them taken outside to a waiting car. Mengele and the documents fled first to Gross Rosen concentration camp and then into Czechoslovakia. There he joined with Hans Kahler, a close friend, co-author, and one of Vershoyer's twins researchers. The Russians liberated Auschwitz on January 27th, about 3 p.m., and Mengele's horrors were quickly discovered. International commissions listed him as a war criminal, but Mengele slipped through the Allied manhunt and eventually escaped to South America. And of course, that is an incredible story in and of itself, which I will find a good account of Mengele in South America to read one of these nights. But let's skip forward. We once again encounter C.M. Goethe of California, and his enthusiastic support of the Nazi genetics or eugenics program. Vershoyer, who had engaged in despicable acts in concert with Mengele at Auschwitz, was ruled that he had engaged in those acts, but the report was kept secret for 15 years. While that report was under lock and key, the second board unanimously ruled that he had committed no transgressions involving Auschwitz. And soon, Vershoyer once again became a respected scientist in Germany and around the world. In 1949, he became a corresponding member of the newly formed American Society of Human Genetics, organized by American eugenicists and geneticists. Hermann Joseph Mueller of Texas, a Rockefeller Fellow who had worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research during 1932, served as the first president of the American Society of Human Genetics. And, as we've recorded elsewhere and in other books that we've read, during World War II, the eugenics label was applied to the Nazis to the point where no one in America wanted to use it anymore. And so the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefellers themselves just changed the word to genetics, but continued research at Cold Spring Harbor and elsewhere. The book next tells the story of Hubertus Stuhld, the director of the Luftwaffe Institute for Aviation Medicine. A Nazi scientist wrote at the time that there were no objections whatsoever to the experiments requested by the chief of the medical service of the Luftwaffe to be conducted at the Rascher experimental station in the Dachau concentration camp. If possible, Jews or prisoners held in quarantine were to be used. This was involving the horrible experiments to see how cold a temperature a human body could survive in, and other types of just extreme quote unquote medical experiments, which were done to people, and many of them died, of course. But Stuhld was honored. Once in the US, he became the leader in American aviation medicine. His work was directly and indirectly responsible for numerous aeromedical advances, including the ability to walk effortlessly in a pressurized air cabin, now taken for granted, but which was also developed as a result of Dachau experiments. He was called the father of U.S. space medicine, and Brooks Air Force Base in Texas named its aeromedical library in his honor. A celebratory mural picturing Stuhld was commissioned by Ohio State University. When Jewish and Holocaust survivor groups, led by the Anti-Defamation League, discovered the honors extended to Stuhld, they objected. Ohio State University removed its mural in 1993. The U.S. Air Force changed its library's name in 1995. In 2003, the state of New Mexico still listed Stuhld as a member of the International Space Hall of Fame. But in 2003, when this reporter, that is Edwin Black himself, asked about their honoree's Nazi connection, a startled museum official declared if he was doing experiments at Dachau, it would give one pause why anyone would ever nominate him in the first place. Museum officials added they would immediately look into removing his name. Nazi doctors Halvorsen and Spatz in 1922 had successfully identified a rare and devastating brain disease caused by a genetic mutation. During the Hitler era, while working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research, Halvorsen and Spatz furthered their research by utilizing hundreds of brains harvested from T4 victims. Right through the 1960s, Halvorsen authored numerous influential scientific papers on the subject. For decades, the name Halvorsen-Spatz has been used by the leading medical institutions in the world, honoring the two Nazis who discovered the disorder. Thousands of articles and presentations have been made on the topic using the name Halvorsen-Spatz. Medical investigators created an international registry of patients with Halvorsen-Spatz syndrome and related disorders. Leading family support groups involved with the disorder have also taken their organizational names from the two Nazi doctors. The National Institute of Health also adopted the Halvorsen-Spatz appellation for its research into the disease. In 2003, the NIH continues to maintain a Halvorsen-Spatz disease information web page. Now, I should just mention that Halvorsen-Spatz did some experiments that were described in detail in the Auschwitz chapter, which I have passed through. The next chapter is called American Legacy. America's retreat from eugenics was precipitated by the convergence of two forces: Hitler's ascent in Germany and the climactic exit of the pseudoscience's founding fathers from Cold Spring Harbor. But it was not a moment of truth that finally convinced the Carnegie Institution and the eugenic establishment to turn away from their quest for a superior Nordic race. Rather, the end was an inexorably slow process devoid of mea culpas, one that saw the major players withdraw only with great reluctance. The real father of eugenics was, of course, Charles Benedict Davenport. Galton was merely the grandfather. It was Davenport who twisted Galton's stillborn Victorian vision into self-righteous social biological action. Eugenics always risked veering completely out of control. It did in Nazi Germany. Pardon me. During the 12-year Hitler regime, Davenport never wavered in his scientific solidarity with Nazi race hygiene, nor did he modify his view that the racially robust were entitled to rule the earth. But Germany's triumph in the 30s, wielding his principles, did not bring Davenport the personal fulfillment he craved. During all his years at the pinnacle of international eugenic science, Davenport remained the same sad, embittered, intellectually defensive man who had first embarked upon a biological crusade at the turn of the century. As one lifelong friend remembered, Davenport remained a lone man, living a life of his own in the midst of others, feeling out of place in almost any crowd. Davenport could acquire international celebrity, but never personal happiness. The Carnegie Institution continued to back eugenics long after its executives became convinced it was a worthless non-science based on shabby data, and years after they concluded that Harry Hamilton Laughlin himself was a sham. Laughlin and eugenics in general had become the butt of jokes and the object of reprehension as far back as 1912, when the world learned that its proponents planned to sterilize millions in America and millions more in other nations. Scientists from other disciplines ridiculed the movement as well. Despite the widespread derision, eugenics persevered as a science under siege. battling back for years, fortified by its influential patrons, the power of prejudice, and the big money of Carnegie. But the Carnegie Institution's patience began to erode as early as 1922, when Laughlin became a public font of racist ideology during the congressional immigration restriction hearings. Carnegie President John C. Merriam continued to be embarrassed by Laughlin's immigration rantings throughout the 1920s, but he tolerated them for the greater agenda of the eugenics movement. However, Laughlin struck a particular nerve in the spring of 1928 when Merriam and a U.S. government official were touring Mexican archaeology sites. During the tour, Mexican newspapers splashed a story that Merriam's Carnegie Institution was proposing that Congress severely limit immigration of Mexicans into the United States. It was Laughlin who prompted the story. Merriam immediately instructed Davenport to muzzle Laughlin. Merriam, feels especially that you ought not go further, Davenport wrote to Laughlin, helping the House Committee on a definition of who may be acceptable as immigrants to the United States from Spanish America. The Spanish Americans are very sensitive on this matter. It will not do for the Carnegie Institution of Washington or its officers to take sides in this political question. Yet Laughlin did nothing to restrict his vocal activities. In early 1929, the committee inspected the Cold Spring Harbor facility and concluded that the accumulation of index cards, trait records, and family trees amounted to little more than clutter. They, quote, are of value only to the individual compiling them, the committee wrote, and even then, in the most cases, they decrease in importance in direct proportion to their age. Some of the files were almost 2 decades old, and all of them reflected 19th century record-keeping habits, now obsolete. The massive records yielded much private information about individuals and their families, but little hard knowledge on heredity. Carnegie's officials first focused on eugenical news, which had become a compendium of American raceology and Nazi propaganda. Although eugenical news was published out of the Carnegie facilities at the Eugenics Record Office by a Carnegie scientist and functioned as the official voice of Carnegie's eugenic operations, the Carnegie Institute did not legally own or control eugenical news. It was Laughlin's enterprise. Carnegie wanted an immediate change. Well, the story goes on to how Carnegie and eventually gets rid of Laughlin, and that's part of the transition from calling it eugenics, recognizing how bad the publicity is associated with the Nazis as they come in, and trying to get rid of this guy Laughlin. It's interesting that Vannevar Bush comes in as the Carnegie president in 1939. And I'll read this. On January 4th, 1939, newly installed Carnegie president Vannevar Bush put Laughlin on notice that while his salary for the year was assured, Bush was not sure how much funding the ERO would receive, if any. At the same time, Jews from across Europe continued to flee the continent, many begging to enter America because no other nation would take them. In March of 1939, the Senate Immigration Committee asked Bush if Laughlin could appear for another round of testimony to support restrictive remedial legislation. Bush permitted Laughlin to appear and only asked him to limit his unsupportable scientific assertions. Indeed, the Carnegie president reminded him, one has to express opinions where he appears in this sort of inquiry, and I believe that yours will be found to be a conservative and well-founded estimate of the situation. Bush added that he had personally reviewed Laughlin's prior testimony and it was certainly well handled and valuable. After testifying, Laughlin received a postcard. As an American descendant of Americans for over 300 years, I'd like to learn what prompted you to supply the Senate Immigration Committee with so much material straight from Hitler's original edition of Mein Kampf. Laughlin then explained the Jew as an immigrant into the United States, that Jews were being afforded too large a quota because they were being improperly considered by their nationality instead of as a distinct racial type. By Laughlin's calculations, no more than 6,000 Jews per year ought to be able to enter the United States under the existing national quota system, the system he helped organize a half-decade earlier, but many more were coming in because they were classified as German or Russian or Polish instead of Jewish. He asked that Jews in the United States assimilate properly and prove their loyalty to American institutions, that it was greater than their loyalty to Jews scattered through other nations, unquote. Laughlin and the ERO proudly sent a copy to Reich Minister Wilhelm Frick, as well as to other leading Nazis, including Vershoyer, Linz, Plutz, and even Rudin, at a special address care of a university in occupied Czechoslovakia. Well, forgive me for skipping around, but I wanted to pick up on that notice of Vannevar Bush acting on behalf of Carnegie Institution as its president, trying to get rid of Laughlin while Laughlin is still determined to restrict Jewish immigration at a time of the Holocaust. And that is what happens when you let these pseudoscientists have the backing of a Carnegie, of a Rockefeller, of a Ford Foundation. Well, the chapter goes on, and I hope that eventually they did get rid of Mr. Laughlin, no relation. The next chapter, Eugenics, becomes genetics. After Hitler, eugenics did not disappear. It renamed itself. What had thrived loudly as eugenics for decades quietly took post-war refuge under the labels human genetics and genetic counseling. The transition was slow and subtle and spanned decades. Some defected from American eugenics as early as the 1920s, prompted by a genuine revulsion over a movement that had deteriorated from biological utopianism into a campaign to destroy entire groups. For others who defected in the 1930s and 1940s, it was the shock of how Adolf Hitler applied eugenics. For America's eugenics holdouts, it was only the fear of guilt by scientific association with genocide that reshaped their memories and guided their new direction. It took a Holocaust, a continent in cinders, and a once great nation bombed and battled into submission to force the issue. Originally, human genetics and eugenics were one and the same. At the turn of the 20th century, American breeders of plants and animals had turned their hybridizing skills and social prejudices on their fellow man, trying to manage humanity the same way they managed crops and herds. The American Breeders Association created its eugenics committee in 1903. In 1904, the Carnegie Institution founded its eugenics installation at Cold Spring Harbor. The word genetics did not exist at the time. In England, meanwhile, research into Mendel's decades-old discovery of cellular elements had advanced and was sorely in need of a new dedicated field of study. By 1905, William Bateson, the man who several years earlier had promulgated the rediscovery of Mendel's theories, was now privately referring to the new science of heredity as genetics, from the same Greek root Galton employed. Bateson publicly announced the new science during his inaugural address during the Royal Horticultural Society's Third International Conference on Hybridization in 1906. The science itself is still nameless, declared Bateson. I suggest for the consideration of this Congress the term genetics, which sufficiently indicates that our labors are devoted to the elucidation of the phenomena of heredity and variation and their application to the practical problems of breeders, whether of animals or plants. Shortly thereafter, students of genetics began referring to the transmittable cellular elements as genes. By 1912, Cambridge University received a sizable endowment for genetic studies, and in 1914 established the world's first chair in genetics. Mainstream European and American geneticists were primarily devoted to the study of heredity mechanisms, probing the structure and interactions of enzymes, proteins, and other cellular components. They understood that man was a more complex animal than that had both conquered and was conquered by his environment. In Europe, human studies of cellular mechanisms were undertaken, but slowly. Not so in America, where breeders distorted Mendelian principles into eugenics and then subsumed nascent human genetics. The two words were synonymous in the United States. And that brings me to the last chapter. Well, let's make one exception and read the last bit about eugenics becomes genetics. The American Genetic Association, formerly the American Breeders Association, also continues today. As of March 2003, it was headquartered out of a scientist's home in Buckystown, Maryland. In the 1950s, the American Genetic Association still listed its three main endeavors as at the top of its letterhead as eugenics, heredity, breeding. As of 2003, most of the organization's early 20th century papers were in storage. As of early 2003, American Genetics Association leaders knew little of the association's past, but the group still publishes Journal of Heredity. Once a font of eugenic diatribe, it is now a completely different journal with a different and enlightened mission. Planned Parenthood went on to promote intelligent birth control and family planning for people everywhere, regardless of race or ethnic background. It condemns its eugenic legacy and copes with the dark side of its founder, Margaret Sanger. Planned Parenthood exists in a community of other population control groups, such as the Population Council and the Population Reference Bureau, many of which sprang from eugenics. Cold Spring Harbor today stands as the spiritual epicenter of human genetic progress. Following the war, it devoted itself to enlightened human genetics and became a destination for the best genetic scientists in the world. In the summer of 1948, a visionary young geneticist named James Watson studied there. He returned in 1953 to give the first public presentation on the DNA double helix, which he had co-discovered with Francis Crick. The world is now filled with dedicated genetic scientists devoted to helping improve all mankind. They fight against genetic diseases, help couples bear better children, investigate desperately needed drugs, and work to unlock the secrets of heredity for the benefit of all people without regard to race or ethnicity. Genetics has become a glitter word in the daily media. Most of the 21st century's genetics warriors are unschooled in the history of eugenics. Most are completely divorced from any wisp of eugenic thought. What now? The short answer is nobody knows. The world will not discover the latest human genetic trends in books like this one, but rather in the morning paper and on the evening news. Almost as soon as any author's page is typed, genetic advances redefine the realities, the language, and the timelines. By creep and by leap, the world will be alternately shocked and lulled, and then shocked again to learn how rapidly humanity and nature are changing. Today's headline is tomorrow's footnote. In 1978, Louise Brown became the world's first test tube baby, and a braver new world shuddered. Since then, in vitro fertilization has become common reproductive therapy. In 1997, Dolly the Cloned Sheep captured cover stories and stirred acrimonious debate across the world. Shortly after that, several cows were cloned in Japan, but the news merely flashed across CNN as a fleeting text report behind the comical headline, quote, "utterly amazing." In 1998, the Chinese government launched a program to clone its pandas. Shortly thereafter, Spanish authorities approved cloning of a bucardo, a recently extinct mountain goat. In 2000, Virginia scientists cloned 5 pigs. Entire menageries are in various stages of being cloned, from monkeys to mastodons to family pets. Human clones are next. In late 2001, when editors were discussing this book, the experts insisted we were decades away from the first human clone. As chapters were being submitted, the prediction of decades shortened to years. By the end of 2002, these same experts were debating whether any of several competing scientists had already successfully created the first cloned babies. There is no shortage of willing donors or parents, nor rumors to supply the field. Legislation enacted in several countries cannot address the international dimensions of this, where, who, and how of impregnation, gestation, and conception itself. Like eugenics, Newgenics would begin by establishing genetic identity, which is already becoming a factor in society, much like ethnic identity and credit identity. DNA identity databanks are rapidly proliferating. The largest group of databanks warehouse the genetic identities of criminals, suspects, arrestees, and unidentified individuals whose DNA is found at crime scenes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Combined National DNA Index System, CODIS, was inaugurated in 1990 and has been steadily databasing DNA from criminal encounters. All 50 states have now passed laws creating state databanks that feed CODIS using the FBI's software. By March of 2003, these state databanks were just becoming operational, but legal reviewers have already pointed out the state-to-state inconsistencies in collection and dissemination standards, as well as storage protocols. The FBI databank, which in March of 2003 maintained more than 1.5 million profiles, is growing by some 100,000 profiles a month. And the Department of Justice has asked the FBI to prepare for up to 50 million. It next goes on to talk about insurance companies and how insurance companies want this data. And when we talk about insurance companies wanting this data, it brings back what we talked about with the umbrella company and the online game involving something called the Umbrella Corporation, which seems to refer to the travelers, which had the symbol of the umbrella. That resonance to me is what brings all of these books together when I say, okay, that's what that is. This is the genetic information that is craved by people who are betting on lifespans, life insurance, health insurance. How long am I going to have to pay this person's medical bills? How long am I going to have to subsidize this person's living in a old age home? And to me, the scientific aspect of this is all generated in order to help control population. To get back to the title of the book, The War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. This book, being from what, 2003 can only hint at what we know now about the way genetics are going to be used and are being used to decide who gets to have children, who gets to live to an old age, and who gets favored economically. The idea that eugenics is over, it's just converted into genetics or eugenics, is an invitation to transhumanism. The idea that there's going to be a better human race connected perhaps to computers. Perhaps we are just going to have a insert in us that's going to help us to access all the information, such as Andy's putting up for us now. But I would like to tie this problem, this moral problem, to what we were talking about earlier today in the earlier show about the southern right of the Scottish Rite, the southern jurisdiction Scottish Rite of the Freemasons. That was the Albert Pike show this morning. And you have, once again, science is neutral, okay? Learning all about genetics neutrally, may be a great thing, as this author is hinting, at the end of his book there, that, yeah, it's great to know this stuff, but how do you make sure that it's not used to benefit the elites when they're the ones that are able to finance the research in the first place? And with this active depopulation program that we've seen with Georgia Guidestones, with all of the comments of the various royals, such as Prince Philip, I think I can say that you know who I'm talking about, and Prince Charles, and these people that are now executing these creepy programs through, as we've been also studying, through the possible weaponization of diseases, the weaponization of the common cold, and keeping us under conditions that we can't interact with each other, to be shut down, to not get the sunlight that we deserve. I am definitely concerned that science is being perverted to control and eliminate parts of the human race, as well as a huge part of nature at the same time. I couldn't help but note once again the diminution of the monarch butterfly, and the habitat being destroyed, as well as their feeding. As they try to fly those thousands of miles, they need someplace to eat. And these type of environmental degradations are not caused by humanity generally. These things are being engineered so that there's scarcity, so that we become dependent upon the great corporate cartels that have been created in the past 150 years. Well, I think I am going to wrap it up with that book, War Against the Weak. I think the great value of it was in the beginning of it, where it described how they would go out and just scoop up people in rural parts of the country, in Virginia in particular, take them to the Western State Mental Hospital in Stanton, Virginia, and not even tell them that they were going to sterilize them. This is a continuous program of a war against the weak, of getting rid of the people that are not favored with great health or with the proper color of skin, if you want to put it on a racial basis. And the idea that there's positive eugenics, meaning, yes, we want to make everybody healthy and we want to improve the children, but we want to do it in a natural way involving natural processes. What these folks are doing with these experiments is against nature. It's against humanity, and it's crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated all the time. Well, let me check with you guys. I'm Corky Goss, always there to cheer me up. Infinite energy is understood. It is old. That's the thing. You know, we could supply everybody with everything they need. It's scarcity. The artificial scarcity is what keeps the corporate cartels in business. And as they cut down trees, as they demolish water systems and take away our fresh air, they destroy our health, they destroy our environment, they create scarcity, which means that we have to fight with one another to get scarce resources. And that is the game that they want us to keep playing for the next, 1,000 years. So the difference between a society based on a few elites and a whole lot of enslaved people, that's the British system. That's the system of plantations run by a few educated, egotistical, Anglo-Saxon often people, versus what we call the American system of individual freedom, based upon the dignity and the image of God that we believe is in every human being, not just some. Thanks for being with me tonight. I think I'll go ahead and wrap up the show. And tomorrow, of course, I take Wednesdays off to take care of my things. I will see you tomorrow night with a review of The Phoenix Program by Doug Valentine, one of the great books you'll see on the book train at screamingospreys.com. I want to thank Andy for his engineering tonight and producing, and for the great sound and video, as always. We'll see you again tomorrow night at 8 p.m. for The Phoenix Program by Doug Valentine. Good night.